Today, I'm excited to have Bo Abrams on the podcast. Bo is the co founder of Kommu, a trust based home sharing and travel platform. He's also previously worked at companies such as Paul Weiss, Steelhouse, and Canyon Partners, and he has an MBA from the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Having Bo on the podcast was super interesting because there's this whole new suite of applications coming out that not only leverage your network, but your network's network to get this inherent benefit of a trust-based transaction that happens between the two parties. And then, of course, talking about the early stage struggles and just some of the successes that Bo has seen was very, very interesting. So with that said, I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hey, Bo, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, super excited to have you on and talk about Kommu and get into your startup journey. But before we get started, always love asking guests what brought them to this point. There's always a very interesting story. Typically, there's an interesting story that got them there. So, what sparked your interest in startups and specifically in the travel and hospitality space?
Oh man. First, I will try to preface this with I will try to be as streamlined as possible. But obviously, as you can imagine, it's a long story that brought me to startups and then ultimately to starting my own company. But initially, right, like I think a lot of people out of undergrad, I was a poli sci major at a liberal arts college, and I had no real idea of what I wanted to do. So I took a job in finance because it was in LA and I was in school in Philly, and I was like, great, LA finance. That sounds like a win. I had no idea. I didn't know a thing about finance. Um, and so that was a great experience. I was there for 3 years at this hedge fund on really the marketing side. I started as an assistant, and then I went to basically another kind of big asset management firm. And I got to that point where I felt like, yeah, you can build a career, you can try to climb that ladder, but it's a
Yeah.
long journey. And there's a lot of people here that are, making great money. They have these huge relationships. Like it's going to take, there's no guarantees that I can go in and make an impact and, feel that growth. And so I kind of just did what I think a lot of millennials and Gen Zers do, which is think like I should go to a startup where I can make an impact.
Hmm.
And at that same time, I will say I had a friend. She had a rare disease, and it's called cystic fibrosis. And it's all to say that like I was sick at one point in college, and when I came back, and I've known her my whole life, I realized that was probably one trillionth of what she goes through every day. And so I really started to feel like I needed to do something in that space. And
Right.
so I'd started a nonprofit with her and another friend that was under the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and it was about lung transplant rejection research. And that's all to say in that space. While I was working at the startup that was called Steelhouse, it's now called Mountain. It's an ad tech startup.
Hmm.
I started that nonprofit, and what I found was the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is the largest disease focused nonprofit in the US. And that's a rare disease. It affects 30,000 people in the US. And you're thinking, how is this bigger? How does it have more assets under management than the American Cancer Society?
Yeah, that's what I
And
was thinking.
yeah, you're like, how is that even possible? And
Yeah.
it's because they pioneered the venture philanthropy model. And in that model, instead of just investing into research and labs and like hoping that things, work out, ultimately they started taking investments and betting on companies and kind of running those like a portfolio and saying, okay, of these, which ones, the ones that win that we've invested in that are solving for, helping us cure CF. Now we have ownership stakes that we can, liquidate when those go and are successful and drive even more impact much more quickly. And so it was a good example of like, if you can allocate capital efficiently into the right founders that are building those companies, you can really drive more of that outcome rather than just kind of like being a nonprofit where everything has to go to the underlying, cause, but nothing ever actually gets done.
Yeah.
No offense to most nonprofits, but I think there's some that feeling out there. So that's a long-winded way of saying like those were kind of these two inflection points right before, I decided I wanted to change my career, where I was like, I want to go do something.
Mm.
So I applied to business school with this idea of going initially into venture healthcare. I knew I wanted to go to the top business school, so I took the GMAT 7 times. I paid for the business school consultant, and I basically spent all the money I had trying to get in. Didn't get into the top business schools even. So I was supposed to go back east, but COVID hit. I didn't want to leave my family in LA. And by the way, that was fun too. It's like you're inside for the year before COVID, studying and working your ass off to go to business school and travel, and then COVID hits, and you're like, great, this is my life.
Right.
But ultimately, I decide to go to UCLA. I apply round three. They give me half of a scholarship because I think they were freaking out at the time of getting people into, butts into seats. And they're like, Bo's down the street and he's going to a different business school if we don't get him. So
Yeah.
I did that, and I realized quickly there that I would not be really making an impact in venture healthcare. I figured like I'm going to lose to the PhDs and the MDs there. I
Right.
did end up working in VC, but it was really right before business school that what prompted or really preempted Kommu began. So that was, I think, a lot of setup of just like what got me to the point where then all of a sudden, again, now there's a huge change that led me to being a founder out of business school. But I want to pause there in case there's anything before I go on another diatribe about my life.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of stuff I could dive into. One of the things you mentioned there, and this is something I've actually toyed around with a lot in my head, is this relation between impact and profits and not profitable companies and nonprofit. So it's really interesting how you mentioned the cystic fibrosis. I forget the name of the foundation, but
Cystic
several.
Fibrosis Foundation, yeah.
Is this a cystic? Okay, perfect. Yeah, like that foundation, uses a venture model in order to make a pretty big impact. And I think, that's one of the things I've been toying with as well. Just thinking personally, like, hey, I know there's a lot of great non for profits out there, but if we look at the biggest impacts in the world, I think a lot of it actually is driven by for profit companies. So trying to find the basis there is just something I've been interested in. So it's very cool that you brought that up. And that's definitely something I'll check out. And then it's funny. So you mentioned the MBA program. I know it's not a formal way of doing this, but I feel like doing a startup is like doing an accelerated MBA in some ways because, at least when you do an MBA, if you don't do well or if you're learning, you maybe go bad on a test or two, but you can learn enough to get past things. In a startup, it's like, hey, if you don't figure out the business fundamentals, you're gonna sink real quick.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little ironic because I will say two things about the MBA. One is, an MBA traditionally has been a place to go kind of get on a path, right? It's like, especially
Yeah,
if you miss the, let's call it the investment banking or consulting window out of undergrad. Now all of a sudden you can recruit because they otherwise it's really rare and hard to get into a McKinsey or Goldman Sachs. And then really it's about getting into business school that is difficult. Once
yeah,
you're in, it's basically like you can learn what you want to learn, but like they don't want you to fail. Grades don't matter. It's a social period of time. And like, ultimately you could learn anything in a business school program online for free. It's a
right,
very expensive network building tool and you get to travel. But really, I think a lot of it is you need time to figure out what you want to do, again, ironically, because you have to write your essays so specifically as to why you're like going to business school and what you're going to pursue. And that's like a whole process. But yeah, like the MBA is almost a scarlet letter in the startup community because, even like, most startup successes, the sort of trope is that they're dropouts of undergrad, that they just went out and built. In an MBA, you're like risk averse. You're literally going back into the system of school just to work in as a cog in a machine, most
yep,
likely, until you
yep,
figure out what you're going to do next.
yep, 100%. Well, so very interesting path. I wanted to continue that actually. So you got into the MBA program at UCLA, and
Yeah.
and and you were going through it, and then you realized, hey, I think I'm gonna have to start making a company. Like, what was the jump there?
Yeah. So this is just this is the classic make my life harder than it needs to be Bo
Mm,
story. But ultimately, I got in and I'd worked really hard to get in, and as I said, I'd spent a lot of money because out of undergrad, I feel like I really didn't play that game well, and I lost all the rich kids that went to like these great schools. I did worked hard and I applied myself, but I had no tutors, no consultants, no nothing. I just did what I could do.
right.
And I was like, this go around, I'm not losing to those kids. And so I went for broke doing, like, as I said, the applications, the tutors, the consultant, the GMAT 7 times. This is nuts, but I did it. Um, and I decided after going to UCLA, I wanted to take a trip to Montana because I deserved a break. And it was a kind of one of those places you can go in COVID and just be apart from people, but be in beautiful places and enjoy,
Yeah,
right? So I went to Montana and all I could afford at that moment in time was 4 nights at a crappy Airbnb in Montana.
sure.
And I was having such a great time. I really was. And I remember thinking like, because we had used Turo when we were out there, it was me and my partner at the time. And, it was like, she had told me about Turo and I'm like, oh, this is cool. It's peer to peer, car sharing, like, because we couldn't get a rental car at that moment in time. And I'm
Yeah,
like, man, if people are doing this with their cars, like, why can't I do this with my home? And it really, it spoke to this two-pronged problem, right? It was on the one hand now, short-term rentals, Airbnb in this instance, it was more expensive than a hotel for this kind of, I would call it, lesser experience at this back house in Montana.
Right.
We're talking $300 like a night, and beyond that, my place in LA is my most expensive asset. The one I'm sitting in right now, like this is
Yeah.
my sanctuary. It's very personal, but it takes up most of my worth, and it sits empty while I'm gone because I can't list it on a website like Airbnb. And so that was what sparked the curiosity that I took into business school, and I just couldn't stop thinking about. And
Yeah.
that is ultimately where I met my co-founder Gus, who is also an LA guy. He's an engineer. He was coming from Cisco. And we're just talking as friends, and we kind of talked about that. We're like, why are we? We both realized we were both remote capable workers at our previous jobs before the pandemic, but that we're at business school to travel a little bit, like not so secretly. And we're like, why is it that we didn't travel that much with like
Yeah.
pretty well paying jobs? And it was because it was that realization of, oh, even though the demand was unlocked for us, it's so cost prohibitive to have that problem on both sides, and that there aren't really much any alternatives to that. And so we both were like, let's think about this for a second.
Right.
And we came across this website called homeexchange.com. And
Okay.
Home Exchange has been around for 30 years. They're based in Europe. And they ultimately are a home swapping platform. So you can swap homes directly. There's a point system to do an asynchronous swap, which is really
Mm-hmm.
just a sublet with points instead of, dollars.
Yeah.
But it was this feeling of like, wait a second, this company that's really geared towards older people, like homeowners that are 40 to 65, that isn't, in my opinion, branded so well, and the product isn't that great of an experience. They're doing $30 million in ARR, and that's
Oh
before the
wow.
pandemic. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, so the pandemic just unlocked travel for 100 million Americans to be able to travel and live anywhere, basically in perpetuity. And most of these people can't list on Airbnb or list elsewhere. They're turning to all these different groups on Facebook, or they're posting on their Instagram or whatever it might be, or WhatsApp. And there's a home swapping site that's doing 30 million in ARR that's not hitting the right market properly. Like, let's build
Yeah.
that. So that's where we started. We were a company called Swapped, like
Okay.
Swap Apartment. We did
Yeah.
all that stuff like lean through business school. We knew that there was an opportunity. We just didn't know what we were doing to go, I would say, seize it.
Right.
Business school had us make many many business plans without like necessarily learning how to run those lean experiments, but we taught ourselves, and we did a lot of those, do things that don't scale, like matchmaking for people behind the painted door of a website, and so on
Yeah.
and so forth. And long story short of that is, we start getting recognized. We start winning some, like, I call it awards and fellowships, and ultimately we win a big pitch competition in business school, and we realize there's something here, but it's not a home swapping site.
Right.
uh, a lot of it goes back to feedback. We can talk about that and go on a deeper there. But it's to say, like, we found this broader opportunity to build what Kommu is today, which is
Yeah.
a social marketplace that lets anybody share their homes with and through the people they trust, all the way up to an open network. But
Yeah.
it's like, if you centralized all of the first, second, third degree connections that you have, how you know them, who you're connected to, there's all this liquidity of homes and guests available to us at any moment in time, and you could choose how you want to list to them and do it for a subscription model that's very cheap, and make sure people are not listing for a profit, and
Mm-hmm.
you've got yourself a lot of value there. And we were like, some of our competitors raised right before we graduated in June of 2022, and we're like, oh, we're right there with them, if not ahead of them. Like, here we go, we're about to get our 5 million, 6 million round. And then we graduate, and the market takes the biggest dive in 15 years. But we just were like, hey, doesn't matter, student debt, credit card debt, whatever, like, we see that this is right there for the taking, and we got to go build it. And that's what we did.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know what? Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that first off. It's funny how you mentioned, you decided to you're at business school and you're like, you know what? How can we make things even more harder? Like my life isn't hard enough already.
It's been, I am the luckiest person I know. Truly, I have a great family. I've been given every privilege you could be afforded to be
Yeah.
born in this, like, in a country, and that is to say, I think I've been given myself the most self-imposed, hardship by the poor decisions that I make and when I make them than anybody I know. Like, I'm like, you don't have to feel like you're battling all of the time, Bo. Like, you can also
Yeah.
just be happy and work hard, but here I am in the middle of
Yeah,
that
no,
right
I
now.
I definitely relate to that. So I think it might just be a common problem for founders. But you know what? Talking about the fundraising situation at the end. Well, first of all, very cool that you guys started with Swapped and then you switched around based on the feedback. I think those small pivots, of course, is what makes great startups. So very cool. I'm very interested to dive actually into the trust based model that you guys have there with the connections. But before I do that, you mentioned the fundraising aspect of things, and of course, in 2022 we go from a ZERP era, zero interest phenomenon, to funding is cut, except basically for AI startups or very specific niches. So obviously that's not a great environment. But at the same time, I feel like the startups that are able to trump through it and still keep going will do well, as especially nowadays. Like yesterday, from the time we're recording this, the interest rates are coming down now, so I feel like things are starting to hopefully clear up and things will pick up. But we'll see what happens. But I think like yeah, these last 2 years have been difficult for non AI startups, especially. So hopefully
Or
things
not
will
non
start
Web
picking up.
three. I mean, we were there through the Web three era too. Like it was just, it's always something, and it's funny that these patterns still happen. Like even these VCs would acknowledge that there's a bubble in AI, and like they're still going to write those checks because their LPs are saying, well, what about this AI startup? And what about that? And you're like, hey, if you don't have some contrarian bets or like
Yeah,
pick based on what, you can get access to that is not just what everybody else is doing, you're going to lose in a power law game. And in that power law
100%.
game, then you will not exist in 3 to 5 years. So if that's, you want management fees to not exist in 3 to 5 years, like that's fine with me.
Yeah, I think, I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but like, I think you can accept that there's like people are like, oh, what are you talking about? AI has so much value. We still haven't seen the top of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think you can still accept that AI has a bunch of value and still it can still be true that a lot of VCs are very over indexed on it. And that's like that can be
Exactly.
true.
AI is AI, and right now we are in the middle of essentially what happened with the internet in the dot-com bubble. It's to say like, yeah, the bubble burst, but everything we do is predicated now on that internet that was formed there. AI will be bigger than that in so many ways,
Exactly.
and it is that moment in time. But that doesn't mean that you get to now make all these concentrated bets and think that you're going to pick the winners. There's now 5,000 horses in the race, and you think
Exactly.
you're going to get the 10 most important ones. They're already there. They're the
Yep.
platforms, and they'll
100%.
take their
Well,
startups out pretty quickly too if they start to scale.
100%, 100%. But you know what? I think we could even have a whole separate
Yeah,
hour-long
yeah,
conversation on this. So I will divulge right now, but perhaps we could do that in a future podcast. But yeah, so you talked a little bit of Komu, where Komu's a platform that connects user with the personal network for home sharing, but also the open network, as you mentioned. And one of the really interesting things there is that users can host trusted friends, interest groups, and communities on their own terms. I think it's a nice, cool mix. Like of course you have Airbnb, which is just fully open, and then you have different other platforms like couch surfing is a big one, like Facebook
yeah,
groups. I think there's a website for that as well. And
yeah.
so I know there's like really interesting mixes in terms of people traveling and trying to find places to live at. But I think this trust based system is very unique, and especially at this point where you can find social connections for people. There's enough platforms, enough friends of friends that you can track and actually make a very unique model. And of course, I see people posting on Instagram every single day saying, "Hey, do you know anybody looking for a sublet?" Or I'm leaving my apartment for 2 weeks. So it's a system I think people can get accustomed to, or they're already accustomed to. But it'd be interesting in a platform. So anyway, you guys are obviously the experts, so I am curious to know, how did you guys ultimately get to that trust-based system? I know you mentioned a little bit of the feedback there, and how's it been going for you guys? How do you actually get that network effect?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting journey, and I think like if you look at us and some of the competitors that have come online, like it does come back to this concept of trust. And trust is a really interesting thing, especially when you talk about like friends and friends of friends and groups. I think a lot of people think about that and they think this is small, like my network is small, without really realizing, for instance, that like it's an exponential, opening up of the network from like 10 friends to literally hundreds, if not thousands. And so it's not that hard, right, to get like, let's call it liquidity of hosts and guests as long as you have friends. The trick was, or I guess the key insight was like, as we were doing the swapping, when we were doing the swapping platform, two things happened. One was we were connecting people to do these swaps. And there was a lot of just, even with like a point system for an asynchronous swap and whatever it might be, it was really difficult to kind of create enough liquidity in that marketplace to make it work. It was like, yeah, maybe you get a lot of people wanting to go to New York. Like that's always going to be the case. But
Yeah.
in that same moment, it doesn't mean that you're going to get a lot of people, enough people to go to Miami. Right. And like that's like, you're going to have to figure out how to balance out this internal currency.
Hmm.
And so that's one thing. And then two is, even in this internal system where you might be taking a percentage of like, or like a fee for a night, you know, like let's call it a nightly fee or a subscription fee. At the end of the day, like if you're creating these networks, like, you know, let's say we went high end membership as one of our options. Once you and I meet and we do a swap and we have a great experience and we save money, we're just going to disintermediate, right? Like we've
Yeah.
built that trust.
Right.
And we were getting to that point with our users where they were like, well, how do I trust this person? Like, you know, do you guys do background checks? Do you do this? And we're like, we did all those things. And, you know, ultimately what we did reveal is like, yeah, once you get on that trip, when you get that action that you were a little bit maybe not accustomed to initially, if you're not an early user or doer of this on like Facebook groups, like you had mentioned,
Yeah.
you loved it because you had a better experience. You felt that kind of camaraderie, you felt that connection, and you saved money and you did that trip that you couldn't take
Right.
otherwise. But then again, the same thing would happen of like, oh wait, but now we don't need swapped. We can just do this directly in the future and text each other and just like, you know, we're friends now.
Yeah.
And so that coinciding with our users saying like, you know, ultimately through user feedback, the people they trust the most are the people they know, and then through the people they know,
Right.
we were like, wait a second, we don't have to be a swapping platform. We can actually be swaps. We could do sublets. We can do pet sitting. Like we could be this OTA, so to speak, like this one platform that rolls all these different networks that we see in the market up.
Right.
And then we can give you the privacy controls to say, oh, well, maybe I want to list just to my 10 closest friends when my spare room's available. And it's a workflow tool for that. And I'm never going to charge them, but I would like let them know that I'd love them to pay for cleaning, you know,
Right. Right.
or maybe it's an open network and you're like, I'm just doing fee free Airbnb, but I've got my Instagram, my LinkedIn on my profile to social proof, you know, in that those other domains or networks that pre-exist that we
Yep.
already, you know, social proof on. So that was kind of this aha moment for me and Gus of saying, wait a second, like social is really the way to go. It tends to be the one that wins. There's never really a winner in a category until the social player is built. It's what people prefer. It
Yep.
drives those network effects, as you can imagine, which we can talk more about. But I think the big issue was we built it, and the initial version of Kommu, we're like, all right, let's get our friends on. You know, you need to invite friends to then like connect with them through your phone contacts, and like now you'll build these networks from the bottom up, and nobody
Yeah.
was doing that because you would
Right.
imagine you'd get to this network, you'd download Kommu, you'd be excited, and you'd be like, there's nobody on here that I know,
Yeah.
and then we'd lose you. And we're like, we don't want to gatekeep this. We want to like learn from it. And what we realize is it's actually, if we start open and then let you go down from there, it attacks the core issue at hand, right? You're like, oh, these people that we're pulling from these different channels, WhatsApp, Facebook, posting on Instagram, they have a need right now. It's a
Right.
financial need that they would prefer to be done with somebody they know and trust. Come for that tool of getting finding a place to stay, or listing, to finding a guest to list to, and then stay for the network. The more groups you join, the more friends you add, the more options you have to find even more of those stays.
Yeah.
And once that network's built, it has more staying power, because it's like, oh, if anybody tries to copy us, we've already, we've got Davik's network on there. Like it's
Right.
easy. The people he went to college with, the people that he trusts, like he's not going to switch because they're on there already.
Yep.
And so
100%.
that was where we went and thought this is going to be the big winner in the space. We
Yeah.
continue to believe.
It's really interesting how you mentioned that, because I think one of the startups I started pretty early on when I was in my journey was a two-sided marketplace, and that's I came to realize very quickly that that is probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest, type of startups to start, just because you have to really balance out the needs of both sides of the market, and unless you have a existing network, it can be very difficult to do that. So it's very interesting how you guys saw that problem and had to pivot around that, right?
Yeah, well, but it's what's the most interesting is that, like, obviously, for any listeners that don't know about like the two-sided marketplace problem, right? It's a cold start problem, and it's typically like you need supply on there
Yeah.
first to go get demand, and like that's the hardest thing is typically getting supply on. For us, supply is the easiest thing to get on. Like we're trying to scale demand to match supply now,
Okay.
but it's because these hosts, again, they have a financial need They're mostly millennials and Gen Zers in these major cities that are paying a lot of their money to the rent. They're in
Right.
massive amounts of consumer credit or debt, I should say. And they want to travel, they want to spend and live their lives and experience. They're gone 30% of the year. And the fact that there are any, 28-year-olds posting on Facebook groups or paying to join Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups to sublet that have no social proofing, like no assurances or things that they want, was like this kind of like despite test. You're like, oh, the fact that you even go there because there's no alternatives in the market, it's kind of like how why Airbnb spun out of Craigslist.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, there's a regulatory mode here that Airbnb can't tap into
Right.
because they've become professionalized. They've essentially gone from Uber X to Uber Black, and we're like, there's an Uber X opportunity here,
Right.
and we're gonna go take it.
100%. That makes sense. I mean, I've been through it myself personally. Like I was trying to find a sublet for living for a couple months in San Francisco. Um, exact same process. I went on a bunch of Facebook marketplace groups, Craigslist, God knows what I went on, and half of them were scams. Like and I basically had to do the social proofing myself. But
Right.
even then, especially as someone who wasn't in the area at the time, it was very very difficult to actually know what was legit and what wasn't legit. And this is something that's a massive problem, not only for myself. I can attest to many people I've talked to who have been through that. So even just a little bit of social proofing goes a long way.
Well, then that's what we've done with this basic, the product that's out in the market is it's been that it's like this has been basic social proofing. It's been more of a streamlined process for you to see like those connections and whatnot. But like obviously on the consumer side, that's the whole point. It's like people are wanting to pay us to
Yeah.
underwrite both sides of the market for for hosts. It's protection plans. It is ID verification of the guests. It might be reviews of the guests and so on and so forth and how you're connected. And on the guest side, it's knowing that when you get off that plane, you're going to get through that door. And if you don't get through that door, Kommu will put you up at a hotel for 3 nights. We'll find you another place, and then that we can regulate that market authentically.
Yeah.
Like we all know that Airbnb scrapes and Uber too, right? Like they scrape bad reviews of drivers and hosts because they have to cater to them to keep them those professional businesses going. But we'd rather build a system where it's like, oh no, this is honest. Like this person honestly wasn't clean, and I'm saying that review maybe anonymously or whatever. But the point is, this is how you build trust.
Yeah.
Is you have to still intermediate to some extent as the network gets wider, but that's what people are willing to pay for.
Right, right. And so one really interesting part there is, so I understand what you're saying in terms of finding people through connections. So hey, a friend is subletting, so there's the connection there. But then you also mentioned the open market, especially as a preliminary strategy to start getting the other sides also rolling. So, of course, with that, like I mentioned, there's different variations. Like Craigslist is basically going into the wild west in terms of you don't know what you're gonna get. And Facebook is pretty much right there, honestly. Like the groups can do a little bit more curation compared to Craigslist, but
You got it.
even there's so many bots, even with that, it doesn't matter. Airbnb maybe is too aggressively on the other side, where it's like, hey, if you're not a professional company and this is not your business, it's very difficult to be on Airbnb. So how do you guys balance that for Kommu? Like, where do you think you fall on the spectrum, and how can your users on the open market specifically trust the postings there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's a core issue that we address a lot directly with our users in that we're on that platform talking to them every day. I will say like there are users that reach out to me that I don't know that well necessarily, and they might be like, "Hey, do you know this person? I saw you were connected, whatever." And every single time, we're very honest. Like I would sometimes I'll be like, "Actually, I don't know. I wouldn't let that person stay at my place if I'm being
Right,
honest," or I would, but I'm much more risk tolerant than you might be because I'm the founder of this company.
right,
That goes a long way. But just in terms of like the systems that we've been built to date, it's been a few things. One is by being on your mobile phone and having two factor, and then being contact import based to essentially see if your friends are on Kommu, you've kind of created an initial layer of trust, right?
got it.
You're like, okay, this person had to verify their phone number. It doesn't mean we haven't dealt with spam or bots or things that look, like that we have, and that's a great
Yeah,
problem because you're like, okay, we're scaling and things are happening that we need to address. But the truth is, we know what we need to build into the product to actually really create this. I would call it like this open experience that is technically still private and curated. And so I'll give you an example of what we're getting ready to launch. It's to say, like, let's say I'm in my home right now. I'm a Como host. I would have this link that I could share anywhere of just my home. You wouldn't see information about the address, whose home it was. You know it's LA generic area, whatever.
Yeah.
And then let's say you came across that, like somebody posted it in your company Slack channel and you clicked it. You would get to that point of booking. And then it would say something along the lines of, hey, this host is a Kommu premium user. It allows this person to list to friends of friends, to groups, like it explains that value. And it says, by
Yeah.
the way, if you want a 30-day free trial or whatever, like this is what it is. And we put you through that flow of like, now you're going through ID verification. You're going through phone and all that verification. As a host, first and foremost, I could be blocking that home from, let's call it property managers if I really didn't want to let them see that, even though I would encourage everybody on Kommu to tell their property managers that they're letting a friend stay there, and like they just don't want you running a business like an
Yeah.
Airbnb under their guys, but they're okay if you talk to them most of the time.
Yeah.
Um, but you can control who's seeing your availability, who's seeing. By the way, people do share their trips on Kommu, so that's another reason why friends use it. They're like saying like, "Who's my network in New York?
Right.
Who's traveling there?" That's a different story, but that's part of it too. But it's this idea of um, the the mechanisms aren't that complicated to build in to give you this open experience that is about the transaction, and then to say, oh, now you can get much more information and value and connection by going into that subscription model. And
Right.
we believe we can do that for free, and you'll stick around because you'll see, like, don't you want to know when those 10 more homes in Paris become available in May and get push notified and know that there's $70 a night, that there's a trip that you could be taking that you didn't, and there's somebody that will take over your spot in San Francisco while you're gone. Like,
Yeah.
wouldn't that be worth 2 nights, a year in terms of subscription fees on Airbnb to save
Right.
$10,000 in travel plus, per year? And
Right.
that's the name of the game.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. And I guess that sort of is a nice segue into what I was going to talk about after this. Is like, you know, there's very different business models for this type of thing. So Craigslist is actually, I guess they just do ads. I'm not even sure what their business model is personally. Facebook is just trying to promote more users to come onto their platform, install ads as well. Airbnb gets pretty aggressive with their cleaning fees, service fees, a whole bunch of different fees. Where does Kobo fit in that? Like, how are you guys navigating this reality? And I know it's early stage, so of course,
Yeah.
I assume things can change very rapidly.
Yeah. So, I mean, full transparency, and I'll lay it out for you in terms of like both where we're at, what we're doing, and just like what we believe is, we know to be true. The consumer model that I've been talking about this entire podcast, like we know that is going to work, just basically in terms of based on what our users tell us, based on what we see in the market from competitors and other, pre-existing companies. And the way we're going to win is really being this Costco player. It's to say, like, you're paying this annual subscription and this monthly subscription. You're getting all those benefits that I talked about earlier, right? Like the protection plans, the assurances as a host or guest,
Yeah.
the verification. But ultimately, the biggest kicker will be we're not going to let people list their home for a profit. And we have data and tools available to actually do that, and like
Mm,
ways in which people will be able to contest that and say, hey, like my home is not, you know, 3,000 a month to buy, which was $100 a night on Komu if you were going to list for sublet.
right.
But like again, many people list on Komu for pet sitting. Many people gift their homes for free. Many people swap homes on Komu. It doesn't need to be that you're subletting necessarily, but we're saying, hey, you have a right to have somebody in your home and to recoup your sunk rent. If you want to list for a profit, you have to register with the city of LA, with the city of New York. Like those ordinances are a good thing.
Got it.
And that is where we're going to come in and really work with these cities too, and say, like, look, look at in New York, you pushed Airbnb out of the market. Great, we agree with that to some extent because of how many people were professional managers. Now hotels are $600 a night on average in New York City right now.
Right.
There are no. What are the alternatives? How is that a fair, affordable thing for people to need to pay?
Yeah.
So that's our kind of holy grail. Holy grail there is to say, like, we are going to be this everything but a profit company.
Yeah.
And that's what unlocks primary homes. It's really
Interesting.
that short term rentals are second homes that are investment properties. They're great for group trips. But if you look around, whether that's your apartment, maybe that you're sitting in right now, or your parents' home that they would never list on Airbnb, but would probably share with their friends if it was an easy, seamless experience, like that is what we're going after to create a market. So that's our key differentiator from, I would call it, the short term rental in the hotel industry on
No,
that
I
side.
think that makes a lot of sense, and maybe some I'll be trying. Maybe some older folks are missing on it, but I can tell you every single day on my Instagram, I see people listing, saying, "Hey, do you know a friend who can sublet for me for the month of November?" or like what every single day. Like, so this is such a big
Oh,
problem.
don't get me started on the generational gap. I'm like these the boomers. I'm like they have no idea how financially insecure we are as a generation, and that like we are going to solve these problems one way or another. But like that, yeah. Guess what? $600 a night at a hotel. It's not a feasible thing for most millennials and Gen Zers right now.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I mean, even beyond that, just like posting it somewhere, because it's not something you'd post on Airbnb. It's not something you really want to post on a public Facebook group. So it's basically just trying to use social media platforms that are not optimized for this to do it, which is not its ideal situation.
Well, it's also, and this is there's a separate business model that's B2B that we can talk about
Yeah.
momentarily, but I will say this also speaks to like what the social nature of our product does, right? It is to say it's not just about sharing your home. That is the primary problem we need to solve and do well first. We had people though listing, you can this feature that we had that we kind of pulled back just to make sure we ironed out the home sharing model, but is that people are using Como again as like find my friends at the city level to keep
Mhm.
track of where their friends are based, where they're traveling, and who they trust to share their homes with, obviously. And this is all literally from Airbnb talking about this all the time and just not being able to build it. It's just a regulatory moat opportunity there. But
Right.
it's this idea that like we travel to connect. Like when I go to New York, I'm going to see my friends that live in New York, and I want to like be able to let them know ahead of time seamlessly and not be like a schmuck that sends 10 text messages, five people reply. I feel like the other five don't want to see me and hate me. It's probably true. And then I get there and a buddy's like, "Oh, dude, my place in New York was available. I'm actually out of town, but I'm learning that after the fact." So
Yeah.
that social mechanism is a very interesting way to drive liquidity of inventory because people are just listing trips and you're like, "Oh, if Ian's going to Paris, maybe this place in New York's available." It's not awkward to ask and let him know that I'm coming to New York to kind of create that liquidity.
Yeah.
And then think about all the other things that opens up. It's Instagram is just a bunch of people sharing their travels, and it's status as a service, right?
Yeah.
It's saying like, I look at me, I'm a world traveler, I'm valuable, here I am. And we're like, take that and move it to Komu, and you've got one of the most engaged, viral sort of location based networks on earth, and you can control who sees again, where
Right.
you're going, who you're listening to, and it's all based on the movement of these generations constantly.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. It's funny. I think really interesting related vertical there, and I'm sure you guys are looking into is, I see a bunch of my favorite travel vloggers will go around the world and like, they'll go couch surfing and they'll meet people locally, or like they'll meet subscribers or like whatever. Um, so I mean
Totally.
that's a very interesting point side as well, right? Which is like, hey, it's a way for you to not only find a place to go at, but meet people as well.
Well, think about recommendations, and again, there's some great companies trying to do this, and I think I'm a fan of a few of them. But like, even at the end of the day, it's like if I know that you're going to, let's say, New York, and that
Yeah,
you took a trip there, and then we sell that data even eventually, let's call it to restaurants, and we're like, Divix is coming to New York, and he is going to like be here these dates. His friends recommend your restaurant like 3x the average Yelp user.
yeah,
Do you want to? You could build a micro like ad network that is so targeted to individuals based on trust that could be a huge opportunity in of itself. But again, you have to hit the milestones of the core thing first to get there, and you need the network effect for all of those things to take hold.
yep, 100%.
And
Okay,
then
well
there's
that
the
makes a
B2B
lot of
model,
sense.
which is the downside management of that, but that's a different conversation.
Yeah, I know. But super interesting. Thanks for going over that with Komu, and I'm very excited to see where the platform goes. Honestly, I think I was like, if you'll have me, I would love to sign up, honestly,
It's
and see what's
free.
going on.
Anybody can sign up, and like that's part of who we are. We're like, get on there, build your network out. We just want you to save money and enjoy it
Yeah,
and tell your
well,
friends.
I would appreciate that. I'm trying to save money, and it's funny. I just went to New York and I crashed at one of my friend's place. So like, it was I had to ask around and do whatever. And eventually I found out like I crashed my friend's place. But if I had Como, maybe it'd be a lot easier. So
I'm going to New York for free in October because somebody's coming to my place to pet sit my dog, and I'm going to New York to pet sit their dog on
there you
Como. I
go.
mean, it's
Well,
it's a beautiful thing.
that's the winning message right there, right? So, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Bo, for coming on the podcast. I have just one or two questions more before I let you
Please.
go. Uh, Talking about more, I know we doing startups, of course, we think big, we think a lot on a day to day a lot, but I love to tap into that big vision just for 2 seconds before we go back to our day to day processes. But like, what do you think is the future of home sharing? Like, where do you think this industry is going to evolve, and like, where do you think trust based platforms like Kommu will play into this?
Yeah, I mean, people talk a lot about community, and I think it's a buzzword that is, you know, used a lot inappropriately to some extent.
Hmm.
Um, but that's why we're Como. It's literally for community, right? And in our case, what we're saying is like, actually, if you look at all the various communities that each one of us is a part of, it's a mass. These are massive networks that are, overlapping with each other.
Yeah.
And so, even if you don't have a community of friends, which we'd be trying to help you build regardless, like then we have that open network. But that's all to say, I think the future of Komu is exactly what I talked about earlier, of creating this network of primary homes and travels and sharing that in a way that is proving that travel is a social connected phenomenon. Like it is
Yeah.
the globalized market unlocked. Like you and everybody else that's under the age of, I'd say, 35 knows we want to travel, we want to see the world, we want to experience it. We have one life, and
Yeah.
we'll do anything we can to make that happen. And we want to see the people that we love and trust, and not be isolated in our apartments all day long. So
100%.
Komu's going to empower that, I hope, and I think I really believe if it all works out, we're the next great social network, which is a term that when I was a VC, like to say that I'm building a social network, like I'm like, this is the stupidest thing you could try to build right now.
Yeah.
But I really believe it is capturing that in its core essence and being about connecting in real life and
No.
being a good thing. So
No.
that's what we're hoping to do.
100%. Yeah, I think just like you hit it right on the nail. Where I think, especially after COVID, this it's accelerated the amount of people want to travel, go out and see the world. And it's just becoming more and more of a standardized thing. Like people, because of the internet, bunch of different factors, influencers, social media, whatever. Like
Yeah.
people are just wanting to go out more and go see these things. And
And like it's like sublets, and that has a connotation, right? And it's to say that I think home sharing is really incorporating of short term rentals to some extent, but it is to
yeah,
say, like, think of it like there's a future where there's still a massive hotel industry that's growing. There's still a massive short term rental industry that's $3 trillion that's growing,
yeah,
and there's still a new primary home market that's massive and growing that we want to be the leader in. Hotels, I'm going to stay at a hotel when there's a wedding or whatever, like, or it's a special occasion. I love hotels. Short
right,
term rentals, if I'm with my family in the future, or I'm with my friends in business school or whatever, group travel, like bachelor parties, 100%.
yeah,
And when it's me alone or with my girlfriend, and we're traveling and we need a place to stay in a city or whatever it might be for 2 weeks, you better believe Komu in the primary home sharing market is where we're going first.
yeah. Well, you know what? Worst, like I mean, I think things will all be great, but worst come worst, you got a great network of people that you can go crash
I mean,
in the
Coma
process.
works. Coma works so well for me, and it's like that's like kind of how I'm like, how do I get everybody to have the experience that I have?
Yeah,
Because
yeah, yeah,
it's that saved me so much money. I'm so broke still. I cannot afford to travel anywhere without Komu.
yeah. Well, maybe if I would love that type of experience, so that's why I definitely have to get on Komu. But last two questions I have before I let you
Sure.
go is just is there a book that you recommend us checking out or reading or that you really like?
Oh man, in terms of like the broy, yeah, the broy tech books, I really did like Zero to One by Peter
Yeah.
Thiel. Um, but yeah, I would say right now I'm reading The Great CEO Within, which I really enjoyed, of just like talking through like an operating system for CEOs, because I think it's hard as a new
Mhm.
CEO. And then there's a book called Red Notice that I just liked in general. That's a New York Times bestseller that is really fascinating. So that's like my one of my favorite books.
Okay, well, I've definitely read Zero to One, but I haven't read the other two, so I gotta add it to my long list, and eventually buy the books, have it on my bookshelf, but never actually get around to
I have
reading it.
too many. I have too many books. I'm like, what? I'm like, I look like such a loser with all of these like tech product books that I haven't really read yet. And I'm like,
Yeah,
maybe read other categories of books if you live that all day long.
same thing happens with me. Like I'll be like, oh, I gotta read these books, and I'll buy all of them, and then like it'll be at night after work, and I'm like, you know, I had the book on my nightstand, and I could very much read it, but then Twitter's there, and I'm like,
I mean,
I
I'm
could
with you,
scroll
man.
Twitter for an hour and
I buy things before I commit to them. Like I bought a
yeah.
surfboard and golf clubs, and that made me become a surfer and play golf because I was like, I financially invested. Books, unfortunately, are still too affordable. Where I'm like, okay, I lost $20, and like
Yeah.
that's the word. That's not great, but it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. It depends for me. Sometimes I'll have these times where it's like, okay, I'll read, and like I'll go crazy for 2 weeks, and I'll keep doing what I'm doing right now. But
Yeah, I
anyway,
gotcha.
hopefully I get around to that. And then the last question I have, and I know you sort of mentioned this earlier, but like, what are the next steps for you and Komu? What can we look forward to?
Yeah, so I mean, right now we are in the throes of essentially turning on all of that consumer, all those consumer protections and that product that people have been wanting, excuse me, for so long. And so that hopefully should be out in the next few months. Like we really want to bring on, the team is still just me, Gus, and a bunch of interns and part-time workers, and we're the top rated home sharing network in the
Right.
app store. We've saved users $1 million to date.
Wow.
We've got 800 hosts all over the world. Like it's really starting to go. And so we're like, hey, we need an injection of this capital that we should have hopefully in the next again like week or so to just turn these things on and go do it and get the team around us that is not just me and Gus. And then we think it's like then at that point you're off and running,
Yeah.
and we're
Yeah.
excited for that. We also have launched a B2B2C pilot, so we actually sell directly to companies now. We just had our first paid pilot launch this week, and so in that
Wow.
model, if your company's a client and you stay, and let's on a business trip, let's go say you go to New York, you text your friends and you're like, hey, if I book your place on Kommu, my company will give you $100 a night as a gift for
Mm,
me to stay with you instead of a hotel, and then we can take a percentage of that. So
right.
that is also really exciting for us because we're like, okay, now we have this like great B2B mechanism to get our core users onto the platform to like, save companies money through this downturn. So we're excited about that.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I think from there on out, it should be hopefully people are just continuing to rave about us. Like we have that amazing network of people that love us, and we want to go scale that to, the millions and millions of users that we think would continue to love us, the friends of those friends, and so on and so forth.
No, 100%. I know that was my last question, but you mentioned that B2B2C model, and that's actually very intriguing because I remember when I was working at a former startup before I just started doing my own things. I used to make a couple trips down to San Diego, and I had a friend who lived there. And so yeah, my company used to pay me instead of if I didn't do a hotel and I used to stay at my friend's place, they used to actually pay me a little like something per night. So I think that model is actually really, really, really promising. Especially like how you mentioned in New York, the hotel costs just keep going up, or in general, anywhere in the world, but like especially in the primary hotspots where these companies send employees, the
You
hotel
got it.
costs are going up and up and up. So I think something like that would actually be massive. So I'm very, very excited to see that
We,
as well.
we think there's a huge opportunity there. It's obviously also just like it could be the leverage point slash go to market to unlock the tremendous opportunity that we still see in Como. But like in the meantime, we're like, this makes my life a lot easier.
Yeah.
It's getting a network effect massively is one thing. Getting businesses to come on board to save money and selling directly to businesses is a whole different ballgame. That is very much a playbook that is tried and true. So we're excited about that.
Of course. Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to see what happens. I will definitely sign up for Komu and hit you up on that. And thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Bo. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks for the great questions and for hearing my literal life story. And yeah, please download Komu. Send me a message on there if you have any feedback or questions. We're here to help. And again, thanks for having me on.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and take care.